Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Very good evening. Thanks for joining us. His words were tough. North Korea is a rogue nation which only understands one thing. But tonight the question is whether Donald Trump will take further action after North Korea detonated what it claims is a huge hydrogen bomb. The explosion underground was certainly massive, 5 times bigger than the US bomb which destroyed Nagasaki. Theresa May says the detonation was reckless and an unacceptable threat. Sky's diplomatic editor Dominic Waghorn reports.
Throughout last year's election, the world wondered how would this man cope with a full-blown international crisis. We may now soon find out. Shortly after midday North Korea time, evidence of a man-made earthquake was observed. Its centre, the nuclear test site in the northeast of the country. A far bigger underground blast was detected than in previous tests. Sometime later, state media broke the news. The breathless delivery is becoming familiar. What's new is the claim North Korea has for the first time tested a hydrogen bomb. A claim backed up, say the North Koreans, by these photographs of leader Kim Jong-un inspecting the weapon before it's tested. Experts agree it's small enough to fit inside a missile. North Korea's neighbour, Japan, still recovering from the reckless missile launch over its territory last week, was first to respond.
If North Korea has gone ahead with a nuclear test, this is absolutely not acceptable, and we will have to strongly protest. The National Security Council is meeting now to collect information and analyse this.
China has also condemned the test, but Britain today urged it to do more to rein in its North Korean ally.
Our message to the Chinese is, and we're working ever more closely with them, we think there's more scope for you, the Chinese, to put economic pressure on the North Koreans. It has worked. We have seen signs in the last 6 months of Chinese pressure actually changing the approach of the North Koreans. Let's see if we can do it again.
In Washington, Donald Trump tweeted, "North Korea is a rogue nation, which has become a great threat and embarrassment to China, which is trying to help, but with little success." A month ago, Donald Trump threatened North Korea with fire and fury. It then called his bluff with another illegal missile test. Now Kim Jong-un's launched an even greater provocation, his biggest nuclear test yet. With each escalation, the risk increases of miscalculation, leading to conflict. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
Well, today's test comes more than a decade after North Korea's first nuclear test. That was back in October 2006, when Pyongyang went ahead in defiance of international warnings at the time. After another more powerful test in 2009, North Korea, which was at that time under the control of Kim Jong-un, carried out a third underground test in 2013. That triggered a 4.9 magnitude earthquake. In January of last year, North Korea claimed to have conducted its first successful test of a miniature hydrogen bomb. That was questioned by the time at experts. After a couple of smaller missile tests, on the 4th of July, that's US Independence Day, of course, Pyongyang launched an intercontinental ballistic missile. It claimed that that could hit anywhere in the world. Last month, North Korea said it was carefully examining a plan to strike the US territory of Guam. And today, Pyongyang says it has successfully developed and tested a hydrogen bomb that could be loaded into a long-range missile. That has not been confirmed, but this test did cause an artificial earthquake that is consistent with an explosion almost 10 times more powerful than the last underground test they made. A hydrogen bomb triggers both a fission explosion and a fusion explosion. That effectively makes it more powerful than other nuclear weapons. And North Korea says that this latest weapon can, of course, be loaded onto an intercontinental ballistic missile. Nuclear experts still remain quite uncertain about their ability to do that and for it to actually survive re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere once it's gone up. In a moment, we'll have our US correspondent in Washington on Donald Trump's next moves. But first, let's speak to our diplomatic editor, Dominic Waghorn, who's here with us. Dominic, how much further down the line are we in terms of what Kim Jong-un has done today?
I think he'll be pleased with the way things are going. Let's get inside the mind of this leader who, despite his outlandish appearance, is proven to be a very shrewd operator. He knows that the West and China and Russia have very few military options unless they want to risk him using his artillery to destroy Seoul, the capital of South Korea. What he's most worried about is the rest of the world ganging up on him and bringing him to his knees, and particularly China using economic sanctions to choke off North Korea. So what he has to do at the moment, what he's aiming to do, is drive a wedge between China and the West. And to do that, he needs to goad Donald Trump. And these pictures are going to be very powerful. This is not just him showing what he's got. It's a deliberate propaganda effort aimed at Donald Trump. In the White House, he has somebody who is notoriously thin-skinned, who's already been provoked into deploying anti-missile batteries on the Korean Peninsula that have wound up the Chinese. Now, if he can persuade the Americans to go further than that, send more batteries like that, or possibly there's been talk of nuclear assets, American nuclear assets being returned to South Korea, then the Chinese will be alienated further. That may well be his aim, and it is a provocation. As I say, we have a very thin-skinned American president, not the kind of no-drama Obama that Kim Jong-un was used to in the past. I think the question now is Donald Trump going to take that bait?
Well, you said he's trying to provoke the US president. He has spoken, Donald Trump, in the last few moments. Let's bring you what he had to say.
Mr. President, will you attack North Korea?
Well, there we go. If you didn't quite catch it, Donald Trump said, "We'll see," in response to the question, will you attack North Korea? Let's talk to Sky's Siobhan Robbins, who's in Washington for us. Siobhan, it's getting pretty serious, isn't it? We know that Donald Trump, though, is listening to some of the military figures around him. He's responded to the question, "We'll see." What do we think those people around him will be saying today?
Yes, well, as you saw there, Donald Trump starting his day in church, but now very much focused on how to deal with North Korea, and he'll be meeting with his national security team later to discuss their options. Let's look quickly at the options ahead of them. So essentially there are three main options: do nothing, military options, and then more sanctions. Now, the first, do nothing, highly unlikely for Donald Trump. We know he's a proud man. He has already reacted with fiery language in the past. The likelihood of him sitting back and doing nothing is basically zero. In terms of military options, we heard him leaving church there being asked, will you attack North Korea? He said, we'll see. Now, he might be saying we'll see, but certainly much of the opinion coming out of Washington and the wider world is that this is not a time for military option yet, and certainly he wouldn't have the backing of his allies if he went down that road at this point. So then the final option is sanctions, and from voices coming out here, that looks like one of the things that they're going to be doing. We've heard the Treasury Secretary today saying that they're going to be looking at new sanctions that could potentially cut Pyongyang off from global trade. So that will be one of the things that they'll be looking at to make it even more difficult for North Korea to operate, essentially saying if you want to do business with the US, other partners around the world, then you need to help us to limit North Korea's moves going forward. We should also expect to see more pressure from Donald Trump on his ally of North Korea. We've already seen that tweet today where there's very thinly veiled criticism, of South Korea, even of South Korea there, saying that the time for talk is over. Expect more pressure on them. But this is now the biggest issue facing Donald Trump and also world security. He needs to tread exceptionally carefully so that he doesn't escalate the risk.
Siobhan, thanks. Let's get a bit more now on North Korea's nuclear tests. Joining us from Washington is Michael Fuchs, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a former advisor to President Obama on North Korean policy. Michael, good to speak to you this evening. Thanks for your time. I'd like to start with the most recent of the president's tweets. He says he's going to be meeting Generals Kelly and Mattis and other military leaders to talk about this situation. How much more can be done without turning to a military solution?
Well, I think that the tweet that you just pointed out there shows just how concerning it is the way Trump is dealing with the situation. He mentioned meeting with his military advisors, but did not mention meeting with his Secretary of State, the nation's top diplomat. And that right there shows you, again, the fault in how Trump is dealing with this situation. The first response for the United States to this sort of situation has to be to get in lockstep with our allies in South Korea and Japan. And one of his earlier tweets this morning from President Trump, of course, was to criticize South Korea for its, quote, talk of appeasement with North Korea. And that is exactly the opposite of the kind of reassurance that our South Korean allies need right now. North Korea's goal, one of its primary goals in testing its nuclear weapons and its missiles, is to divide the United States and South Korea. And frankly, President Trump's reaction so far this morning has helped Kim Jong-un.
Some would say, though, that diplomatically, whatever has been happening has not worked. The Obama administrations before, it's been 10 years since they first tested nuclear weapons, and we're at this point. Diplomacy has failed.
Well, I think that the premise for any approach to North Korea has to start with the undoubtable fact that war or a military strike that would easily lead to war in North Korea is the absolute worst option. There are no good military options when it comes to North Korea. And so the strategy for the last 6+ decades with North Korea, since the end of the Korean War, has fundamentally been about deterrence and containment. And that has protected the American homeland. It has protected our allies in South Korea and Japan and the rest of the region. And so fundamentally, that needs to be the strategy going forward. And on the diplomatic side, there are other things that we can do. We can ramp up the pressure on China via secondary sanctions on Chinese banks that are using and serving as flow-throughs for North Korean money. There's also, frankly, the possibility of talks with North Korea while we ramp up the pressure. But again, deterrence, containment, that is fundamentally the strategy that has worked and which President Trump needs to focus on right now.
When you talk about those other avenues, is that what the president means in a tweet about 15 minutes ago, saying the United States is considering stopping all trade with any country doing business with North Korea? Essentially, he means China, doesn't he?
Well, I think that's probably what he's talking about, although it's very hard oftentimes to interpret exactly what the president's tweets mean. I don't think it would be wise to stop all trade with China. That would create a catastrophic collapse, I think, of the global economic system. But I do think that ramping up the pressure in very carefully choreographed and methodical ways on China via sanctions on Chinese banks that are home to the money that flows to and from North Korea is a very, very good way, a next step in terms of trying to change Beijing's own calculus with North Korea. And the last thing I'd note here is also that I don't think that Xi Jinping, president of China, is going to be very happy about this latest test. He right now is in the midst of hosting a major international summit of the BRICS nations, which Kim Jong-un just stepped all over with this test. And so I don't think President Xi will be very happy either.
OK, Michael, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the insight.
North Korea has provoked strong international reaction after testing a hydrogen bomb that it says is capable of being loaded onto an intercontinental missile. It's the most powerful test of its nuclear weapons program to date, condemned by the United States, South Korea, Britain and China, North Korea's only major ally. President Trump is meeting his national security team today to discuss the situation. The test took place at a site in the northeast of the country. From Seoul in South Korea, Yogita Limai sent this report.
North Korea announcing another nuclear test. A perfect success, the newsreader said. Pyongyang claims to have detonated a hydrogen bomb. The world was alerted when tremors were detected at a known testing site in the northeast of the country. Earlier, photos were released of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un inspecting what was said to be a nuclear device. The state claims it could be fitted to an intercontinental ballistic missile. If confirmed, it means Pyongyang can arm these long-range missiles, weapons that put the US mainland within range. To this latest incident, President Trump responded on Twitter, writing, "North Korea's words and actions continue to be very hostile and dangerous to the United States." And he went on, "South Korea's talk of appeasement with North Korea will not work. They only understand one thing." Later, leaving church, the president was asked about military action.
Mr. President, will you attack North Korea?
He said, "We'll see." For months now, South Korea's president said talking to North Korea was a solution. Today, he expressed outrage and disappointment.
North Korea has made an absurd tactical mistake by committing a series of provocations, such as launching ICBM missiles and conducting a nuclear test, which has heightened tensions on the peninsula and is threatening world peace. It will isolate them further.
The latest act from North Korea comes just days after the regime fired this missile which flew over Japan. In response, American and South Korean jets conducted bombing drills with more military measures planned. But it's hard to see what action can be taken.
Certainly our view that none of the military options are good. The distance between North Korea and Seoul is very, very small. They could basically vaporize large parts of the South Korean population, even with conventional weapons.
Here in Seoul, a city that's home to tens of millions of people, we're only about 50 kilometers from the border with North Korea. And at any given time, a mass of weapons is pointed in this direction. And that's why, rather than take a military route, the international community has been trying to put economic pressure on Pyongyang. But that isn't working either. It's been less than a month since strict sanctions were imposed on North Korea. Nothing appears to deter Kim Jong-un. Yogudalamai, BBC News, Seoul.
Well, after the latest and most powerful evidence of the extent of North Korea's nuclear program, what are the options for the international community? Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins has been assessing the possible consequences.
Kim Jong-un and his regime are simply refusing to bow to the outside world. Why? Well, partly because the regime is convinced its survival depends on having the ultimate weapon as insurance against outside attack. But already the North Koreans have such an array of conventional weapons they could kill hundreds of thousands of people, and maybe that's why they've ignored Donald Trump's warning to them last month.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
But the fact is, North Korea has not been stopped by that fiery rhetoric and has now made a new threat which raises the question, can the West stop the North Koreans? The US does have the means, the fire and fury. They could almost certainly destroy the regime eventually, but not before retaliation sparked appalling consequences for South Korea, Japan and the wider region. So could the world live with a nuclear-armed North Korea? Arguably, it may have to, and that would then mean relying on Kim Jong-un to be rational and North Korea to accept the old Cold War restraint that any use of nuclear weapons guarantees mutually assured destruction. No wonder North Korea's immediate neighbour China is pushing hard for international talks with the regime to find some other way forward.
As most options, other options, are fraught with very severe possible consequences, I think in the end one does come down to the line that this has got to be solved, unless you want catastrophe, by negotiation.
But to some leading Republicans, an American military response to all this looks inevitable. This was Senator Lindsey Graham talking hours before North Korea's latest test.
I am 100% certain that if Kim Jong-un continues to develop missile technology that can hit America. If diplomacy fails to stop him, there will be an attack by the United States against his weapon systems.
The stakes with North Korea have never been higher. The ultimate decision rests with President Trump as America's commander-in-chief. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, let's get more of a sense now of the global reaction. In a moment, we'll speak to our correspondent John Sudworth in Beijing. But first to Washington and our correspondent there, Richard Lister. Richard, to what extent is there a sense that this latest test takes us into a new phase as far as North Korea is concerned?
Well, Michelle, this is becoming the most urgent challenge faced by President Trump. He is meeting his national security team today, but they really have no good options on the table in front of them. The North Koreans seem to have dismissed President Trump's fighting talk of recent weeks as simply bluster. So I think the administration is much more focused on sanctions. And the president has said in a tweet that they are considering a total trade embargo against any nation that does business with North Korea. And of course, that means China. Now, the Chinese have resisted any sanctions that would risk destabilizing North Korea, but it looks like Washington is going to force Beijing to make a choice. President Trump has said he will not accept a fully nuclear-armed North Korea, but he also knows that the time available for preventing that outcome is shrinking fast.
So, John, a choice then for Beijing. From your perspective, how does China see this latest test?
Well, in a sign of the possible fraying relations between China and its old North Korean ally, this test came just a few hours before President Xi Jinping gave a keynote speech at a summit he is hosting here. And the government has been quick to react, saying it condemns the test in the strongest terms. But you know, Michelle, despite all of Donald Trump's urging that Richard was speaking about there, the big question is, what will China do? It has toughened up sanctions on some goods, but the reality for Beijing all along has been this. It may not like the idea of a nuclear-armed North Korea, but it fears much, much more the possibility of economic collapse and the chaos and instability that would bring right up against its border. And today, I think, that calculation hasn't really changed much at all.
John Sudworth in Beijing and Richard Lister in Washington. Thank you both.
Good evening. It was in the small hours of this morning when a seismologist monitoring underground nuclear tests tweeted simply, "Oh, and well, an expletive." As global leaders awoke in the capitals of the world, they surely shared the sentiment. This, the 6th North Korean nuclear test, is by far the largest. Analysis suggests it's between 5 and 10 times bigger. And the evidence is consistent of it being what the North Koreans claim it is, a thermonuclear device, a hydrogen bomb compact, enough to be attached to missiles that could strike the mainland of the United States. Also tonight, the Tory party calls for unity, warning their MPs that any rebellion on Brexit could mean Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. So there's been widespread international condemnation of North Korea after it said it detonated a hydrogen bomb at an underground testing facility. It was North Korea's 6th and most powerful nuclear test to date. The device was detonated at the Punggye-ri site, where North Korea has conducted nearly all of its past nuclear tests. The explosion was several times stronger than previous test blasts and triggered an artificial earthquake that reportedly shook buildings in China and Russia. Now, President Trump, when asked if the US would attack North Korea, replied, "We'll see." He's to meet with his national security advisors later. China has urged North Korea to stop taking erroneous actions that deteriorate the situation. Here's our Asia correspondent, Jonathan Miller.
At 3 p.m. local time, an impoverished nation of 25 million people proudly announced it had successfully detonated a miniaturized thermonuclear device designed to ride atop an intercontinental ballistic missile. The great leader signed the order, having gleefully inspected his new DIY H-bomb, shaped like a short fat skittle. Today's nuclear test, 10 times more powerful than the last one a year ago, and exponentially more destructive than the US atom bomb that flattened Hiroshima. The test site at Punggye-ri, near the Chinese border, has been in a high state of readiness since April. For North Korea watchers, this comes as no surprise. It's a situation that calls for cool heads now. Donald Trump woke up to the news and tweeted that North Korea's actions were hostile and dangerous to the United States. The rogue nation, he said, has become a great threat and embarrassment to China. Then he admonished South Korea for what he called its talk of appeasement. They only understand one thing, he said, with his signature exclamation mark. But Kim Jong-un is the only person laughing. Dozens of seismic stations across the world registered the 6.3 magnitude earthquake. The director of South Korea's Earthquake and Volcano Center said analysis of the energy spectrum and sound wave indicated it was a man-made quake. After last week's missile test that sailed high over Japan and 2 ICBM tests in July, Kim Jong-un has again proved he wasn't bluffing, as he's defiantly pushed his luck. It's a poke in the eye for Xi Jinping, who's hosting a business summit, which Vladimir Putin is attending. Today, Chinese state TV said Beijing strongly condemned the North Korean nuclear test. The question is whether China is angry enough to support ever more crippling sanctions. That's what South Korea wants. President Moon Jae-in says his belligerent neighbour should now be completely isolated. I can't help but be disappointed and outraged, he said. North Korea has made an absurd tactical mistake. The usual lineup of denunciation continued with an increasingly exasperated Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, saying Japan cannot accept such conduct. As his Air Force scrambled a sniffer plane to test for radiation, both Japan and South Korea called on the UN to do more to protect world peace. For North Korea, it's been a relentless drive to develop a credible deterrent. It wants to be recognized as a nuclear power. Marshal Kim's regime sees its nuclear and missile programs not as a potential act of suicide, but as a guarantee of its survival. Those watching Mrs. Ri Chun-hee in Tongil Street, Pyongyang today, understand the method in what the world sees as their leader's madness.
It makes me feel really strong. Now, how can our enemies dare to covet our fatherland? We can hit them everywhere.
I feel very confident. Since we have our marshal, we have no need to be afraid of anything.
Tonight, the rest of Asia, America, and the world have more reason to be very afraid indeed.
Jonathan Miller reporting. And I'm joined now by Tom Plant, the Director of Proliferation and Nuclear Policy at Royal United Service Institute for Defence and Security Studies. Mr. Plant, thank you for coming in. First of all, in your mind, what is North Korea trying to achieve here?
Well, as you heard in the package there, at least one aspect of it is trying to secure their survival against the threat of US-led regime change. I mean, that's really the main thing that's driving the development of their nuclear deterrent capability. And the other thing that they might be looking to do also, and I think analysts are picking up on this, is to try and separate the US and the South Korea alliance a little bit, you know, to make it look a little bit less like the US would have the South Koreans back if it came to, you know, if it came to a crisis.
And just put it into some context for us. How big a deal is this test? Because there's been some doubt about whether it's a hydrogen bomb or not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's right to be cautious about the final assessment at this point. On the one hand, it is kind of a big deal because this is by far the biggest nuclear test that North Korea has ever conducted. I mean, it's substantially larger. And if it is indeed proved to be a hydrogen bomb, and analysts in the weeks and months to come will be trying to unpick that, then that's a serious technological step forward. And it's one that they've been pursuing for some time. But on the other hand, it doesn't change the fundamental nature of the challenge that we in the US face. They were already being threatened with a developing nuclear weapons capability, with a missile program of increasing variety and capability, with the ultimate goal of threatening the continental US. Now, what's on the front of that missile, although it's more concerning if it's a hydrogen bomb, it's still concerning if it's a, it's a basic or efficient weapon.
So let's take a look at the international reaction then. First of all, Donald Trump has been using very strong language. I mean, he's just said, we'll see, as to whether North Korea should be attacked or not. He's talked of fire and fury against appeasement that South Korea is supposedly enacting. What do you think that means?
I think it's genuinely very difficult to pass because, you know, if I was to give you an answer to that, it would give me I genuinely don't think that there is a US strategy on this issue at the moment at all. For example, you've highlighted some of the remarks that Donald Trump's made, sort of emphasizing the military option. But we should also remember that, earlier this year, he was talking very much on the other end of, on the campaign trail. He was suggesting that he would meet with Kim Jong-un, that Kim Jong-un was a smart guy. Only a couple of weeks ago, he was saying that Kim is starting to respect us now. I genuinely don't think that the public communications from the President of the US bespeak a serious considered policy at any point. In that regard, what he said today about, we'll see, about military, is possibly the most sensible thing he said so far. Neither confirming nor denying is perfectly sensible at this stage. Now, we can talk further about the wisdom or otherwise of military action in North Korea, but making a precipitate statement one way or the other would also be lunacy.
So then let's turn to China. I mean, China is very important to North Korea, and North Korea is very important to China. Most of North Korean trade is going through China. Clearly, that country needs to play a greater role here.
Well, certainly if you follow the previous, I guess, US model of sort of economic constriction, can you really force North Korea
so sanctions.
To give? Well, absolutely, yes, but a particular kind of sanctions, coercive economic sanctions. There are other kinds of sanctions which are designed to prevent North Korea selling nuclear weapons or technologies, or for buying the kit which helps them develop those programs. So you have to sort of separate those two out. And yes, of course, if China is going to, if the US and others want to pursue this economic coercion strategy, then China is absolutely critical. But I genuinely don't think that China's interests lie down that route, because it would increase the risk of instability in North Korea. It would increase the possibility of regime collapse in a unified, US-aligned, South Korean-dominated peninsula, which is just something that's not in China's interests at all.
We'll have to leave it there for now. Tom Plant, thank you so much for coming in.
I've been